Now, let's talk about language and speech today. Now, the differences between language and speech is that language is central and speech is peripheral. Now, language is central, meaning that the language is fundamental to the communication skills in terms of the content and the meaning of the stuff. And speech is just more like the utterance that is coming out from a person's mouth. Okay, so language deficit is more like there is central fundamental content meaning that is missing or that is a real issue, as opposed to speech problem is that there are no language deficit in the sense that there is no deficit in the understanding or the production of the actual language, but then the speech aspect, just the verbal utterance that's coming out purely that's coming from the mouth, there's an issue. So a person that has dysarthria, for instance, who stutters a lot, that is more of a speech problem as opposed to a language problem. Okay. Now, there are several domains of language. There is phonologic, there's syntactic, there's semantic, and pragmatic. And you'll see that the first three are more left hemisphere dominated, and then the pragmatic part is more right hemisphere dominated. So, what is phonology? Phonology is the sound of the language. And so there are aspects of language. There are morphemes, which are the words, and there are phonemes. Okay, and so phoneme is really the smallest meaning sound unit in the spoken language, as and the morpheme is more like the smallest language of unit that carries meaning. So, and there are things such as the content morpheme that is more like the stem of the word. And then there are functional morpheme, and these are the things that conveys critical information such as ed that says, for instance, sense, or if you add an a or this something that's to negate the word of the content morpheme. So these are like the phonology aspects of the actual words. Okay. Now, syntax is another aspect of language that basically refers to the permissible combinations of words from different categories that can kind of be combined together. And so this is like a rule in a language that specify how words from different categories can be combined. So which means that when you kind of violate the rule of the syntax, you can completely change the meaning of a sentence. So for instance, in English, the order of the words that appear in the sentence is really important. So for instance, if you say something like, I ate the pig, it's not the same as the pig ate I. Okay, so you can see that how just changing the order completely changed the meaning of the language. But this is something that is very specific to different kinds of languages. So if, for example, in Russia, a noun that ends in A is likely to refer to the entity doing the eating. Okay, while the same noun ending in U is likely to refer to the thing that was eaten. So you can see that depending on the language itself, this syntactic rule is also very different. So when it comes to the syntax development, this is how a children really is learning about how the rule of a specific language. So this is why when you are learning a new language, okay, even the way things like, let's say when you're learning the English and when you first learned about the present, future, and the past tense, and then you're thinking that why are there all these rules that on the verbs that you need to change? Why isn't like Chinese that I can just say that today I went to eat something, okay, and then that would just mean exactly the same. I just need to add when I did it. But unfortunately, not all language works as simply as beautiful as Chinese does. Okay. Now, there are several aspects of phonology when it comes to the production of speech. And so let's take a look at several of them. there are many areas, the things that you can articulate. Okay, and so that's the first thing. And then second thing is there is the voicing and the voice onset time, and there it's basically whenever there is a voicing of something, there's going to be a vibration of vocal cords. Okay, and then there's also there's also the place of articulation. It can be coming from bilabial. It can be coming from dental or alveolar. So these are the aspects of where the articulation is coming from. So when a person is speaking very clearly, then his or her place of articulation that is coming out in the way that he or she is producing the speech, that is going to be very clear. And then there's also the manner of production. So uh, so when when someone say that, oh, you sound very nasal, and that's because the the nose cavity is clogged up, and therefore the resonance, it doesn't sound that well. And then as opposed to non-nasal, so it has to do with where the resonance of the production of speech is coming from. Now, when it comes to the speech perception, not the speech production, but the speech perception part of it, when we are trying to understand something that is within the phonology aspect, there are formant, when you kind of think about it, that's the vocal frequency of energy that's associated with vowels. There is the co-articulation, which overlaps in formant and articulation. So these are like the mouth shape is different, and the voice, the location of the sound production is also different. There's also a segmentation, and in which that there is a very strong top-down influence. So there is going to be illusion of the separation that's reinforced of the knowledge of the words. So, for instance, if someone kind of whispers and then say something like uh, "elephant shoes," and the person who's looking at them would just can kind of see it as "I love you too," okay, and but in in reality, that's not really what the person is saying. And then another example is "I'm a love machine," so as opposed to "I'm a love machine." Okay, and there is also McGurk effect, in which is the person who is looking at the speech production versus the hearing the production. Sometimes there is the perception of that is actually bimodal, in the sense that there are combining the data. So then when a person says Baba, but then which is the acoustic stimuli, with the Gaga, which is the visual stimuli, the perceived stimuli is Dada. Okay, so you can see that a lot of it, a lot of the perception is not a one modality specific, but it's a combination of the modality specific. Now, language is specialized to humans. So your dogs don't really understand what you are trying to say to them. They don't really understand like the order of the words, and getting all those words together, what they really mean. Okay, they will know specifically what utterance equals their name. So for instance, this dog's name is Ginger that you see in the cartoon, and so what you say is, okay, Ginger, I've had it. You say out of the garbage. I understand Ginger, stay out of the garbage. What else? And what the dogs can hear is blah 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 Ginger, blah 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 Ginger, blah 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 blah. It's kind of like Snoopy's. I mean Charlie Brown's kindergarten teacher. You're like wah 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 wah. You don't really understand what they're saying. They kind of you. The only thing they'll understand is that, well, you are very mad, and then you're yelling at them, and then there is somewhere in there is their name, and they did something wrong. Okay, that's all they know, but they don't understand the actual content, what is in there. Okay, now let's take a look at where the informations are being processed when it comes to language. Okay, so when you are listening to something, okay, or let's say you're reading something, the content of that is going to come to these two places, the Wernicke's areas and the angular gyrus. Okay, now when you are reading, then information is going to come from the IT area in the brain, and then they're going to go on to the angular gyrus. Okay, here. And then if you are listening to something, then the information is going to come from the auditory cortex and then going to go to the Wernicke's area. Okay, now if you're reading something, then the information they're going to come in from the V1, from the IT, IT, okay, IT, okay. And then they're going to go to the angular gyrus area, and then they're going to go to the Wernicke's area. Now, the Wernicke's area is very important for comprehension of things, okay? Comprehension of material. Now, without a proper Wernicke's area, you cannot really understand whatever you read or whatever you listened, okay? Now, when it comes to the actual production of, when it comes to two aspects, production of the speech and also the fluent production of the speech. So, and also the frequency of what is being said out, that is being dominated by Broca's area. Now, you're probably thinking that, well, is there something that connects between the Wernicke's areas and Broca's area? There is, it's not in here, but this is the structure, it's called the arcuate fasciculus, okay? And then now when it comes to the production of the actual language, then Broca's areas is going to then transmit to the primary motor cortex. And then, of course, as you know, you learned from the motor lecture, when you look at the homunculus of the M1, there is the lip and also the throat, and then the representation that's in the motor cortex, and that is where the motor control of mouth and lips and all these other places that is responsible for speech production that goes on in there. Okay, so this is what it looks like when a person is listening to words. So information is going to come from auditory cortex first, and then they're going to synapse onto the Wernicke's areas, and then from Wernicke's area, they're going to go from the arcuate fasciculus that I have talked about, and then they're going to go transmit to the Broca's area, and from Broca's area, then they're going to go to the primary motor cortex, in which you have a lucid repeating of the information. And this is what happens when you are reading something, when you are not involving in the auditory modality. So when you're reading something, then what happens is that the primary visual cortex is going to encode the words, right? And then they're going to go, some of it's going to go to the IT, and then they're going, because the IT is responsible for identification of recognition of the letters and the words, right? And then that information are going to go to the angular gyrus, and then the angular gyrus is going to synapse onto the Wernicke's area, and then the information is going to transmit through the arcuate fasciculus to the Broca's area, and then the Broca's area is going to, and the rest is basically the same, okay? Now, in the second slide of this lecture, if you kind of go back, you can say that a lot of the language domain are left hemisphere dominated. Okay, so now, which means that for most people, I would say greater than 90% of people, when it comes to English language, then what happens is that all this language are being dominated by the left hemisphere. Okay, now the thing, how do they kind of know about what is being dominant and what is the non-dominant hemisphere? They do something called the WADA testing. So now that's in the next slide. So what is the WADA procedure? Well, the WADA procedure is basically so there is something called the internal carotid artery. And then what happens is that this internal carotid artery supplies the blood to pretty much the entire hemisphere. Okay, so there is one internal carotid on the left, and then there's one on the right, and each one supplies the blood to the ipsilateral side of the brain. Okay, and then what happens is that if you find the internal carotid artery and then you push the sodium amytal, which is an inhibitor of which basically inhibitor of activities, and then when you inject the sodium amytal into the internal carotid artery, let's say, and if you do this on the left side, then you are essentially going to shut down the activities of the brain on the left side and vice versa on the right side. So this is a very good way of determining what behavior is being governed by what hemisphere. Okay, so they have done studies in which that when they basically shut off the left hemisphere by inhibiting the activities that is going on in the left hemisphere, and then when they test the behavior, language behavior or the language task, more than 90% of the population cannot do this very well, and not so much when it comes to the right hemisphere. Okay, so that just kind of said that in more than 90% of the people who are right-handed, by the way, then they are left hemisphere dominated, and then their language center is isolated pretty much to the left hemisphere, because when their right hemisphere is being shut down by the sodium amytal, then what happens is that their language aspect can still do pretty well. Okay, now this is something that is kind of like an overlap between the semantic memory and language. So, and that has to do with how do we understand the language? Well, the understanding of the language is really, a lot of it is based on your previous semantic knowledge. Okay, now imagine if you do not know what a word means, and then it's very difficult to understand it when it's not part of your semantic knowledge. Okay, and so which means that in order for a person to really get a feeling of what is being spoken, to really have a good grasp, a good comprehension of what is going on, of what is being heard, what is being read, he or she needs to first gain the semantic knowledge of the basic words. Now, this pretty much sounds like a second nature to you, but then this is not the case when a child is growing up. They have to learn a lot of vocabulary words in order to gain a fuller picture of the world, and then therefore their reading comprehension do not become better until later on when their semantic knowledge is being brought up. So when the gathering or the establishment of the semantic knowledge word bank or the dictionary, if you will, is really more like gathering data and getting a database of the semantic knowledge going, and then from there, then you can see that once you have a solid or sufficient semantic knowledge word bank, then you can start to really enhance your reading comprehension. Okay, now there's one thing I want to say is that reading comprehension is really multiple aspects. Reading comprehension has to do with the organization of the words, such as grammar, and then there's also the comprehension with the specific knowledge when it comes to the semantic bank, word bank. Okay, so when you kind of piece two of these together, then you can have an adequate amount of the comprehension when it comes to the material. Now, so later on in the aphasia section, you'll see that when you have one with the other, you can really, when you have one with the other that's really missing, then you can really have some issues when it comes to the understanding or allowing other people to understand what you're trying to say. Now, let me talk about the critical period for language development. Okay. Now, if you were to ask your classmates who study another language, which I guess is all of you, because you have to learn like English to attend like DKU, right? So I would predict that you will find out that those who learn a second language when they were young find it to be much easier compared to adults or adolescents. Okay, and then so which kind of means that the earlier you learn a new language, the better off that you will be when it comes to the critical period for language, because there is a very critical period when it comes to a language development. So you're probably thinking that, well, that's learning like a second language. What about the primary language, the way that you were meant to speak in your native tongue? Well, let me introduce you the case of Jeannie. This is the most famous case in modern times. Okay, so in the 1970s, she lived in some rather appalling conditions in LA, Los Angeles. Okay, from the age of approximately 1.5 years old until she was rescued at 13 years old, Jeannie's parents kept her locked down in her own room. And then, so during her imprisonment, no one talked to her, and even when her father or mother brought her food, they would kind of bark at her like she's an animal. So eventually she was rescued at 13 years of age, right? And but it turns out that Jeannie's development for many psychological processes, but not just that, but also physically and motor and emotionally, were all stunted. And on top of that, the most important aspect is that with intensive training, Jeannie was able to make some progress, but the only part that never developed much beyond the level of the toddler is her language ability. Okay, so what does this case really tell us about the critical period hypothesis? Well, what it's basically kind of says that there really is a very important age in life where you must learn a new language, because this is when, remember we talked about synaptogenesis. So during the age around, we'll talk about later, but during the age when the child is growing up, especially around 1 to 3 years old, there is a lot of assimilation when it comes to the symbolic meaning of objects, and then what object translate to for a verbal utterance out of the mouth. And then so when people point at the cup and says that this is a cup, and cup, and then try to have the children say cup, and then the children then make the association with the image of the cup and the hearing of the word cup and then the saying of the word cup. So you can see that there is a lot of semantic gelling meaning like kind of fusing together. So you can see that there are a lot of kind of mixture of the visual information with the auditory information and with the motor output, and also the comprehension and also the memory aspect of it. So this becomes a very important for language development. So language really is a very high order cognitive process. Okay, now if you look at the chart on the right, okay, so this is the test of critical period hypothesis. So the performance of a test of English grammar by adults kind of were originally from China and Korea, and this is directly related to the age in which they came to United States and then were first exposed to English. Okay, now I came to the US around here, so I'm not that bad yet. Okay, but then I just want to say that I wish that I kind of came to US slightly earlier. Maybe, but I have to say that I was also a classical musician, so hearing like the words and also having that aspect really kind of helped me translate things from the auditory aspect. So therefore, the way that I speak is not as badly compared to people who came to the US around the same age. Okay, now let's talk about multilingualism. So is learning two languages or maybe three languages, four languages, is that better than one? And of course, the answer is yes. And I'm sure a lot of you at Duke Kunshan University can really appreciate that. And that's because everything is being taught in English, and most of your native language is not in English unless you are coming from a country that is like Australia, England, United States, or Canada, these traditionally English speaking countries, right? So it turns out that if you were to learn two languages from a very young age, let's say as an infant, these multilingual children, they really show no language confusions and no language delay when it comes to like the number of words or the vocabulary words that are learning. Now, there are some slight stunting when it comes to the actual development of the language, and but that is because there is a good amount of spanning of this aspects. Okay, but then there is not like a huge developing gap when it comes to the actual language delay. Okay, and now this really also kind of starts prenatally. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, basically, it means that the newborns prenatally exposed to just their native language prefer over than other languages, whereas newborns whose mother speaks like two languages during pregnancy, they prefer both languages equally. Okay, now you're probably thinking that, well, isn't that a little bit too late for me? Well, you can kind of do that for your children in the future. Okay, when you are pregnant with them, or when your wife is pregnant with them. Okay, now it turns out that children later on, when they are developing these, if let's say if these are two truly native language for them, uh, the children, they start to build two separate linguistic systems. And now you're probably thinking that, what, is that really true? Because it seems that language mixing really also happens. I have people who I really know, and who, they are both very fluent in English and Chinese. For example, they will substitute Chinese when they're talking in English, and then they would substitute English while they're talking Chinese. And it seems like they are just kind of going flipping back and forth, and then it's making me having a headache having to talk to them. Well, yes, that is true, but this happens a lot when it comes to this is actually like a normal aspect of bilingualism, and this really happens. It's often kind of reflects a gap of knowledge in one language that the children is trying to fill up with the other. So as you can see, the language when you are speaking, it's a very there is like a certain tempo that you need to follow. There is certain rhythm that you need to follow, and there is certain thought process that you have to follow. And then, so when you are having trouble with finding the specific words, you can, then what happens is that you quickly take that from your semantic knowledge from something that you can substitute. And then what happens is that then you try to insert a word that is usually not normally in the same system. But you can also kind of see that there are really some mixtures of vocabulary words that is kind of represented in the same brain area. So this is the things I'm trying to say. Okay, so you see that people who are truly bilingual, they use this a lot when it comes to the mixing code. Okay. Now, what does this actually translate to when it comes to the school setting, when in terms of language learning in the school setting, right? And so you'll see that the more difficult issue really comes to the respect of second language learning in school setting. So some countries with large and distinct language communities, such as Canada, so for instance, they will actually embrace bilingual education in both French as well as English. And in Europe, you'll see that they really force the kids to start learning new English or another European language at a very young age. So this is the way that they try to have the Europeans become much more fluent in English. And so this is why a lot of people there you kind of think that, oh, how come the European speaks English so well, and this is one of the reason. Okay. And so I really think that you guys made the correct choice of coming to DKU, which is really kind of help you to upgrade your English levels to a point that you can really excel in academia and later on in other companies as well, because as we know, English is still a very dominant language in the world, especially when it comes to academia, the sciences, and also in many occupations. And this is still it's kind of like the unofficial official language in the world that most people use. So I think that you guys really make the correct linguistic choices. So in the future, you'll be able to kind of swiftly change between Chinese and English or whatever your native language in English. So this is something that I think is very good for the DKU students. Okay, let's talk about language acquisition and how that process works. So acquiring a new language really involves in many aspects. Uh, to kind of acquire a new language really involves listening and speaking. And if you are trying to learn a written language, it's more about watching and knowing how to write it. Okay. And but this regardless, it really requires both comprehension of what other people are saying to you and also how you can produce what other people can understand. Because as we said before, language really is a way of communicating the correct meaning of what you're thinking to another person and trying to understand what a person is thinking to you. And you can see that the infants they have really because we're social animals, right? So the infants they really have like a start to pay a lot of attention to what people say or are trying to convey long before they were able to say their first words. Okay, so it's really important to make sure that you are saying nice things to your kids after they are born. And this actually starts even prenatally in the womb. Okay. Now, the first step to language learning is trying to figure out what is your native language. And the reason for that is all these different native language, they have their own prosody. Okay. So what is prosody? Well, prosody is the characteristic rhythm and intonation patterns as well as cadences and melody of a very specific language. And this is what makes, let's say, Japanese sounds different from Chinese, sounds different from French, sounds different from Indian, sounds different from like all these German, like other languages. Okay, so you might not understand what a person is saying, okay, when you are listening to them talking like a language, but you can kind of understand that, oh, I think this is Korean, or this is Japanese, or this is English. Of course, you guys know what English sounds like, and understand the meaning, but then, or let's say French, French sounds very different compared to English, right? Or very different to German. If you are more like musically talented, you are able to tell the difference between them right away, even if you don't understand the meaning, because you understood the differences in the process, in the prosodic production of very specific different kinds of languages. Well, infants are very good at picking this up as well. And this is the first way they pick up what is the language that they should be learning. And it kind of identifies with them even when they are in the mother's womb. Okay, now let's talk about developmental changes in speech perception. So what we know is that by the end of their first year, infants start to lose the ability to perceive the speech sounds that are not part of their native language. And so which means that they really start to home in on the speech sounds of their native language. Okay, and in other words, their speech perception is now adult-like, even though they don't speak at that point yet. Now you're probably thinking that, well, what if they cannot speak? How do you know that uh, they have honed in on their native language? Okay, so this is something that Janet Walker did as part of the study. Okay, so what you are seeing uh, down here is that the infant is participating in a study speech perception in the laboratory. Okay, and the baby has learned to turn his or her head to the sound source whenever he kind of hears a change from one sound or another. So which means that when it changes from one kind of language to another language, then he is supposed to turn his head. And then the kind of reward is praise and also a visual display from the puppy, not puppy, puppet, okay, that the experimenter is going to give feedback. We do exactly the same thing for the dog. Whenever she finish her food, then we would clap and then say, "Oh, you did a good job," and she gets very happy. So it's the same thing. So you give the children some sort of reward. Okay, so this is a conditioning paradigm and kind of similar to a Skinner condition paradigm, if you will. Now, how do these infants do? We'll look at the next slide. And here are the results. So you can see that on the x-axis, what we have is the age in months. And on y-axis, this is the percentage of infants that were able to discriminate. And the blue versus the green bar are just difference in the language that they have. Okay, so you can see that what happened is that the infants' ability to discriminate between speech sounds that are not in their native language, it starts to go down. Okay, and most 6 months old from the English speaking families, by the way, so these are all native English speakers, babies. Okay, so you can see that these 6 months old from English speaking families, they readily discriminate between syllables in Hindi versus Netflixaplex, something like that. I tried to find the pronunciation on Google, I couldn't. Okay, but you can see that at 10 months to 12 months of age, they were not able to discriminate, make that discrimination anymore, which means that they have started to hone in on their ability to discriminate or to recognize their native language. This is how your textbook actually interpreted the data. So what could be a actual mechanism that is responsible for this loss of the infants were able to discriminate a foreign language, but later on when they grow up, they were not able to discriminate so well. And it seems that this might be result of synaptic refinement and elimination that we have talked about. So what happened is that this is not only seen in language acquisition, but this is also seen in ASL. Okay, and another thing is that you also see this in face perception as well as musical rhythm. So it's really, really amazing that infants begin to specialize to their discrimination of speech of sounds and really kind of retaining their sensitivity to sounds in the native language while kind of become increasingly less sensitive to non-native speech sounds. So what does this mean? This means that after the synapses has been kind of stabilized, then it starts to get rid of the ones that is not needed every day. And this is one of the interpretation that you would think that is happening because this is a phenomenon that is not only seen in language, but in many other aspects in the mental processes as well. Now, let's talk about speech production development. Okay, so the first thing that the babies have to do before they start talking, they need to prepare for speech production. Okay, so then what happens is that during the first months, the babies they're in, they cannot talk yet, but they're getting ready for it. Now, their initial repertoire during that first month is that their sound is not very abundant. In other words, their repertoire is of sound is not very abundant. But through a lot of practice, we can start to see that infants utilize their vocal cords as their lips and then throat. They start to enrich their vocal repertoire. Okay, so they would produce sound like ooh, ah, and then they can make funny noises with the lips and throat, and then they can switch from vocal cords from very deep voices to a very high screeching voice, and then they can go from a soft voice to a very loud voice. All of these are acts that the baby is getting ready for speech production. Okay, now all of these is kind of is able to get their motor control ready for future speech production. Okay, so the caregivers that are more responsive are more likely to help the infants gain better and more mature vocalization patterns, as you would kind of expect. Okay, now, around 7 months, we start to see babbling from babies. Now, this is a major milestone when it comes to the actual native language speaking. Okay, now what I am trying to say is that the native language exposure is very essential for the development of babbling. Now, how do we know this? Because the infants that were born deaf, that they cannot hear, they produce vocalizations that is kind of similar to babies that babbles that could hear, but then the deaf infants babbling starts much later, and they're quite limited in the repertoire. Okay, so you're probably still thinking what babbling is. Babbling is something like that, like get, where something that like these kind of funny voices that babies make. Okay, and of course, sometimes when you play babies, when you play with babies, you would babble yourself, and this is something that it kind of mimics what they are saying, and it's actually quite cute. You see this happens between lovers as well, and this is the way that people, when they are in love, they kind of go back in the age, and then so there's actually study kind of suggests that when people are really in love with each other, they would kind of engage in this kind of baby talk, because this goes back to an age when they're actually kind of feel that they're really being loved, and then they're being full of love, and then when is the time that when you are getting the most love, and that's when you're a baby, of course, right? So it's actually a good thing that if you and your boyfriend or your girlfriend do this kind of baby talk, that means that they really love you, where you really love them. Okay, anyway, back to babbling. So you can see that the babies that are born deaf do not develop babbling until very late, and their repertoire becomes very limited. And and so this is what you're seeing on the right. So this is a deaf baby, but then instead of showing them the words, they have the parents showing them sign languages. And then you can see that this baby that was born deaf started to use the hand gestures as a way of a kind of substitute of vocal babbling. Okay, so what happened is that essentially they babble with their hands. Okay, now before the infant starts speaking, they need to first exhibit their motivation and intention to communicate with another person. So this is what we mean by early interactions. Okay, so the first indication of in early interactions is turn taking. Okay, turn taking. So what is turn taking is that in normal mature conversations, participants, they would take turns between speaking and listening. Okay, and you see this with puppet shows a lot. Also, the puppet show might have one on one end and then goes like this, and then moving the puppet on one, and then there is another puppet that's kind of listening, that is silent and not moving, and then so the left hand and the right hand puppet goes back and forth, and then makes it looks like it's having a conversation, even though it's kind of all the conversation content, they're all babbling. It doesn't really make any sense. Okay, so this is the first sign of early interaction, and that is turn taking. The second sign of early interaction is intersubjectivity. Okay, so intersubjectivity is really talking about uh, basically when two interacting partners share a mutual understanding. Now let's talk about the actual production of words that are actually coming out from an infant's mouth. Okay, so you can see that the first words, what are words? Well, they're really things that have meanings. So the first words that an infant is going to be uttering, it has to be something that has a true meaning. Okay, so you can see that when it comes to the early word recognition, the 6 months old are actually pretty good with them. They can understand mommy and daddy, because usually when they say mommy, they usually turn their head towards mom, and when you say daddy, they usually turn their heads towards the father. Okay, and but just because they can understand it doesn't mean that they have the verbal or the vocal repertoire to actually produce those words. Okay, so you can see that the early word production does not come around 1 years of age, typically from 10 months to 15 months. And what is usually the first word that comes out from um, and you might think that the first word is usually mommy or daddy, right? And usually it is correct, okay? But it really depends on the language, okay? Of course, usually it's daddy or mommy, okay? And you are right. Um, so the thing that I want to say is that because during this early word production, a lot of time parents, because they want the babies to speak so badly, they they will often misconstrue babbling with words. Okay. Now, once the children start talking, what do they talk about? Well, they don't form complete sentences yet. They can name stuff. They can name like mommy, daddy, gaga, didi, like this kind of things. And also they can say themselves. Okay. Now it depends on their names, but they can definitely say something. They can point themselves and say me. Okay, this kind of stuff. Now, uh, after they start to kind of talk and assign names, words to meanings, okay, then infants, they will say words that are in their very small vocabulary, only one word at a time. Okay, so this phase is referred as the holophrastic period. So which means that the children, they typically express one whole phrase with a single word. Okay, so for instance, if a child is hungry, he or she might say eat, eat, okay, or something like that, okay, or like fan, fan. If you're in Chinese, that means rice, rice. That means I want to eat rice, okay, so something like that, okay. And another thing, what happened is that when the young children, when they want to kind of um, quickly gain their things, there is another aspect with their language use, and that is something called overextension. So they will use the word that is kind of in broader context than is appropriate. Okay, so something that we have said before in the previous lecture is that when the children, they might misconstrue something like anything with a four-leg, and they call this dog. So they might call a cat dog. They might point to a table that also have a four-legs dog, and then so this is really important for the parents to kind of correctly tell them that this is not a dog, it's a cat. So you have to assign the correct voices and the correct word to make the child may have the correct association with the words and the object. This is how they learn about the word, and also because after they hear it, then they can comprehend it, and therefore they can generate the correct speech output for that specific word. But in order to learn the words, they need to make the association of the actual object with the words that they are hearing, and therefore that they can produce. Now, up to like 18 months old, you see that the children really have very limited amount of vocabulary words. So typically they will have about 50 of them. Okay, so this is when they're using a lot of one-word sentences. Okay, and then after that they go through like a vocabulary spurt, growth of it. And so the source of this spur can really come from the people around them or actually coming from themselves. Okay. Now, of course, the most important person for the caregivers is the caregivers who by talking to the infant. And something that is really important for the caregiver is to really talk to the children and point stuff out and say it to the children and kind of encourage them to repeat them after that. So this is a really good way for the infant to really kind of produce the sound themselves and then to quickly make association, because you reward and this kind of love gelling is something very, very positively reinforcing for the kids. Okay. Now after the actual spurt in vocabulary words, then the infants they were able to put the words together, and this happens by the end of the second year. And you can kind of see that the first sentence is going to be something that's very simple, usually two words. Okay, so instead of saying that drink as one word, and they might say something like more juice. That's more specific than drink, right? And then, so this period is also known as the telegraphic speech period. And because it's kind of like telegram, like all the non-essential parts are missing. Okay, now after the telegraphic speech period, then it comes to the grammar period. Now, as I said before, grammar really is this thing that has to do with syntax, and that is the rules in which language, in terms of the sequence and also the ordering of the words and what would make sense. Okay, so for instance, I ate the lobster versus the lobster ate I. is very different meanings, right? Um, Now, in English, nouns are made plural by adding s at the end, right? And the verbs, uh, they are made into past tense by adding ed, right? And then in the verb, when you add the ing, this makes something that is happening right now. And so but there are some notable exceptions, right? So the young children, they recognize these formations. They can generate them into novel words. So you see that they would usually say something like "I go to," right? So they would they would kind of think that, oh, the past tense for go is "goed," okay? Uh, Adding ed at the end. But later on, very quickly, they start to realize this is not the case. Okay, and this something happened. They use this for the this is something called the overregulation errors. Now, what happens in later when it comes to language development? So it turns out that the language development goes way beyond ages 5 and 6, even after the infants can hold like a very adult-like conversations. And this maturity goes well into adulthood. And one of the most striking feature is the multiple meaning of a word, which is really responsible for puns, riddles, and jokes. For instance, the word green can mean this color, right? Or it could mean that you're really inexperienced. Okay. Now you can look up, there's like a lot of English words in even like other language. The word might look exactly the same and sound very similar, but they have two meanings. Now in Chinese, we don't have these problems because usually when you use like a same word for another meaning, the pronunciation changes. So we know what is the context of the actual word that we are speaking about. But anyway, but English, there is no such thing. Okay, so this is one of the major development when it comes to the multiple meanings of the words. All right, that's all I wanted to talk about in terms of language and language development. Now, for tomorrow's discussion, we're going to get ready for debates on language learning, actually a new language learning. So do you want to learn a new language that is similar to your own native language? So for instance, if you are a native Chinese speaker, do you want to learn something like Japanese, where there are like some similarity, or Korean, there are some similarities? Or do you prefer to learn something that is completely different, such as Spanish? Okay, or let's say if you are English native speaker, would you rather learn a native language that is similar to English, such as German or maybe Italian, because a lot of the words in English have Italian or Germanic roots? Or do you want to learn something that's completely different, let's say Arabic or Chinese, or Japanese? Now, why is that? What do you think are the pros and cons for this? This is something that I want to hear you guys' thoughts on this for tomorrow.